Jake pulled his old pickup truck into the dusty parking lot of St. Mary's Chapel, just like he had every Sunday morning for the past 3 years. The engine coughed twice before finally going quiet. He sat there for a moment, watching the sun climb higher over the small town of Millfield. This place wasn't much to look at, just a collection of weathered buildings scattered along a 2-lane highway that most people drove through without stopping. The chapel itself was nothing fancy. White paint peeled from its wooden walls, and the small bell tower leaned slightly to one side. But it was where his mother had taken him as a boy, and after she passed away, Jake felt drawn back here every week. Maybe it was habit, or maybe it was the only way he knew how to feel close to her anymore. At 32, Jake had grown tired of the whispered conversations that followed him around town. Poor Jake Morrison, the church ladies would say, shaking their heads. All alone on that big ranch, such a shame. They meant well, but their pity made his jaw clench. He didn't need their sympathy. He had his cattle, his land, and his routines. That was enough. Or at least that's what he told himself. This October morning felt different somehow. The air carried the crisp bite of approaching winter, and golden leaves danced across the gravel as Jake walked toward the chapel entrance. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it might be a pile of old clothes someone had left by the side door. But then the bundle moved slightly, and Jake realized it was a person, a young woman, curled up against the chapel wall like she was trying to disappear completely. She was wrapped in what looked like an old shawl that had seen better days. Her dark hair hung loose and tangled around her face, and even from a distance, Jake could see how thin she was. Too thin. The kind of thin that came from not eating, not from trying to look a certain way. Jake stopped walking. He'd lived in small towns his whole life, and he knew when something wasn't right. This woman didn't belong here, huddled against the church like a stray animal seeking shelter. "Miss?" he called out softly, not wanting to startle her. "You okay?" The woman's head snapped up, and Jake saw her eyes for the first time. They were dark brown, almost black, and filled with a kind of fear that made his chest tighten. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "I'm sorry," she whispered, scrambling to her feet. Her voice was so quiet Jake had to strain to hear it. "I didn't mean to I was just Hey, it's all right," Jake said, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm Jake Morrison. I come to church here every week." The woman studied his face carefully, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Up close, Jake could see just how bad her situation really was. Her clothes were wrinkled and dirty, like she'd been sleeping in them for days. Her lips were cracked, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion deeper than just losing a night's sleep. "I'm Elena," she said finally. "Elena Vasquez." Before Jake could respond, the chapel door opened and Pastor Williams stepped out. The elderly minister took one look at the scene and sighed deeply. "Oh, Elena," Pastor Williams said gently. "I was hoping you might come inside today." Jake looked between the pastor and the young woman. "You two know each other?" "Elena's been staying here for a few nights," Pastor Williams explained. "Sleeping in the church? I've been trying to convince her to let me call someone, family, friends, anyone who might help." Elena shook her head quickly. "No family, no friends, just me." The pastor's weathered face creased with worry. "She showed up 3 nights ago. Jake won't tell me much about where she came from or why she's here, just that she's got nowhere else to go." Jake found himself really looking at Elena for the first time. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, she was probably around his age, maybe a little younger. There was something about her that reminded him of the wild horses that sometimes wandered onto his property, beautiful but skittish, ready to run if you moved too fast. "Have you eaten anything today?" Jake asked her. Elena's stomach chose that moment to growl loudly, answering his question. She pressed a hand to her middle, embarrassed. "There's not much," Pastor Williams said quietly to Jake. "The church fund is pretty tight this month. I've been sharing what I can from my own kitchen, but..." Jake made a decision without really thinking about it. Maybe it was the way Elena kept glancing around like she expected someone to come after her. Maybe it was the desperate look in her eyes, or maybe it was just that he knew what it felt like to be alone, even if his loneliness came with a roof over his head and food on the table. "I've got a ranch about 10 miles out of town," he heard himself saying. "Big house, just me rattling around in it. Could use some help with cooking and cleaning if you're interested." Eleanor's eyes went wide. I don't have any money to pay you." "I'd be paying you," Jake said. "Room, board, and wages. It's honest work if you want it." Pastor William smiled for the first time that morning. "Jake's a good man, Elena. His mother raised him right." Elena looked back and forth between the two men, and Jake could practically see her mind working. She was weighing her options, trying to figure out if this was too good to be true or just another kind of trap. "I don't know anything about ranch work," she said slowly. "Don't need to know about ranching," Jake replied. "Just need someone who can cook a decent meal and keep the house from falling down around me. My mother used to handle all that, and since she's been gone—" He trailed off, not wanting to sound like he was asking for pity. "What happened to her?" Elena asked, her voice still barely above a whisper. "Cancer. 3 years ago this month." Jake cleared his throat. "Anyway, the offer stands. No strings attached. You work, I pay you, you've got a place to stay. Simple as that?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her worn-out shoes. When she looked up again, there were tears in her eyes. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Jake thought about that. Why was he offering to help a complete stranger? Maybe because he remembered what it felt like when his mother was dying and neighbors had shown up with casseroles and offers to help with the ranch work. Maybe because he'd been raised to believe that when someone needed help and you could give, you did? Or maybe because something about this woman's situation reminded him that there were worse things than being lonely. "Sometimes people need help," he said simply. "And sometimes other people are in a position to give it. Doesn't have to be more complicated than that." Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm a hard worker. I promise I won't cause you any trouble." "I believe you," Jake said, and surprised himself by meaning it. Pastor Williams clapped his hands together. "Well, I think this calls for a prayer of thanksgiving. Jake, why don't you both come inside for service, and afterward you can head out to the ranch." As they walked into the little chapel together, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. He'd woken up that morning expecting another ordinary Sunday, same routine, same loneliness, same empty house waiting for him when he got home. Instead, he was about to take home a stranger who might turn out to be exactly what he didn't know he'd been looking for. The ride to Jake's ranch was quiet except for the rumble of his old pickup truck and the occasional sound of gravel hitting the underside. Elena sat pressed against the passenger door, her small bag clutched in her lap like a shield. Every few minutes, Jake would glance over at her, but she kept her eyes fixed on the passing landscape. When they finally pulled up to the house, Elena's first thought was that it looked lonely. The 2-story farmhouse sat surrounded by rolling hills and pastures, with no other buildings in sight except for a red barn and a few smaller outbuildings. The house itself was well built but showed signs of being home to a man living alone. The porch needed painting, and weeds had taken over what might have once been flower beds. "It's not much to look at," Jake said, reading her expression. "But it's solid." "My grandfather built it back in 1952, Elena nodded, still not saying much. Jake showed her to a small bedroom on the second floor that had clearly been his mother's sewing room. There was still an old Singer sewing machine in one corner and boxes of fabric stacked neatly along one wall. "I can move all this stuff out?" Jake offered, but Elena shook her head. "It's perfect," she said quietly, and it was. The room had windows facing east and south, so it would get good light during the day. More importantly, it felt safe. It was upstairs, with a clear view of anyone approaching the house. Those first few weeks were strange for both of them. Elena moved through the house like she was afraid to disturb anything. She would get up before dawn to start coffee and breakfast, and Jake would come downstairs to find eggs and bacon waiting for him, along with biscuits that were better than anything he'd tasted since his mother died, but Elena barely ate anything herself. She would push food around on her plate and claim she wasn't hungry, even though Jake could see how thin she still was. It worried him, but he didn't know how to bring it up without making her more nervous than she already seemed. The house had never been so clean. Elena scrubbed floors that hadn't seen a proper mopping in months. She organized closets and cupboards with military precision. She even tackled the mountain of laundry that Jake had been putting off for weeks. But she did it all quietly, like she was trying to be invisible. Jake started to notice little things about her. How she would freeze when he came into a room unexpectedly. How she always sat with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. How she would flinch if he moved too quickly or raised his voice to call his dogs in from outside. It didn't take a genius to figure out that someone had hurt her badly. The breakthrough came during the second week when Jake was trying to fix a broken cabinet door in the kitchen. He was getting frustrated with a stubborn screw and let out a string of curse words that would have made his mother wash his mouth out with soap. Elena, who had been washing dishes at the sink, dropped the plate. It shattered on the floor, and she immediately fell to her knees, scrambling to pick up the pieces. "I'm sorry," she kept saying over and over. "I'm so sorry. I'll replace it. I'll pay for it." Jake realized she was shaking. Actually shaking? Like a leaf in a strong wind. "Elena," he said gently, crouching down beside her. "It's just a plate. It doesn't matter." But she wouldn't stop apologizing, wouldn't stop trying to gather up every tiny shard of broken ceramic. That's when Jake understood. This wasn't about a broken plate. This was about whatever had happened to her before she ended up sleeping at the church. "Hey," he said very softly, "look at me." When she finally raised her eyes to his, Jake saw terror there. Pure, raw fear. "Nobody's going to hurt you here," he said. "I promise you that. A broken plate doesn't matter. You matter." Something in his voice seemed to get through to her. Elena's hands stopped shaking, and she let him help her up. They cleaned up the broken plate together, and Jake made sure to throw the pieces away where she could see them go into the trash. After that, things began to change slowly. Elena still jumped sometimes when Jake came into a room, but she started to relax a little. She began eating regular meals instead of just picking at her food. And most importantly, she started to talk. It happened gradually, usually during their quiet dinners together. Jake would ask simple questions about her day, and Elena would give short answers. But bit by bit, she began to open up. She told him she'd grown up in a small town about 2 states over. Her father was a strict man who believed women should be seen and not heard. When Elena turned 21, he'd arranged for her to marry a man named Roberto Mendez, who owned the largest hardware store in town. "I met him once," Elena said one evening, staring down at her plate. "At church, he was ... He scared me. The way he looked at me, like I was something he already owned." Jake felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice calm. "So you left?" Elena nodded. 3 days before the wedding. I waited until everyone was asleep, took what little money I had saved, and started walking. I've been moving ever since. How long ago was that? 2 months. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "I know they're looking for me. Roberto has connections, people who owe him favors. I keep expecting them to show up." Jake set down his fork. "Nobody's going to take you anywhere you don't want to go. Not while you're here?" Elena looked up at him with those dark eyes that had seemed so frightened when he first met her. "Why are you being so kind to me?" It was a question Jake had been asking himself. The honest answer was complicated. Part of it was the way she worked so hard to earn her keep, never asking for anything extra. Part of it was how she'd started humming while she cooked, a soft, sweet sound that made the house feel alive again. But mostly, it was the way she seemed to understand loneliness. She didn't try to fill every silence with chatter. She didn't ask personal questions or push him to talk about his mother or why he'd never married. She just present in a way that felt comfortable instead of intrusive. "I guess I know what it's like to feel like you don't quite fit anywhere," Jake said finally. Elena smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her whole face. made her look younger and less haunted. As autumn deepened into early winter, their daily routines became more natural. Elena would have coffee ready when Jake came in from his morning chores. They'd eat breakfast together while Jake planned his day, and Elena would tell him what she hoped to accomplish. In the house, she'd discovered his mother's garden tools in the barn and asked if she could try to salvage the overgrown flower beds. Jake had said yes, though he doubted anything would grow this late in the season. But Elena had a way with growing things, apparently. She managed to coax some late-blooming mums and asters back to life, adding splashes of gold and purple to the front of the house. The animals took to her, too, which surprised Jake. His cattle were used to him, but they'd always been skittish around strangers. With Elena, they were calm and curious. She'd walk out to the pasture fence and talk to them like they were old friends, and they'd actually come over to see her, even Buster. Jake's grumpy old cattle dog, who usually ignored everyone except Jake, had started following Elena around. Jake would find the dog lying at Elena's feet while she folded laundry or curled up beside her chair while she mended clothes in the evening. "I think you've stolen my dog," Jake teased her one night. Elena scratched behind Buster's ears. "He just, knows I need the company." It was true. Even though Elena was getting more comfortable in the house, Jake could tell she was still carrying a lot of fear. She would sometimes stand at the kitchen window for long minutes, watching the road that led to the ranch. She kept her few belongings packed in her bag as if she might need to leave quickly, but she was healing too. Her face had filled out a little, and there was color in her cheeks again. She laughed sometimes at Jake's dry observations about his neighbors or his struggles with household repairs. And slowly, very slowly, she began to seem less like a scared girl running from something and more like a woman finding her place in the world. Jake found himself looking forward to coming in from work each day. The house that had felt too big and too quiet for so long now felt like a home again. There were always good smells coming from the kitchen and someone to share the day's events with over dinner. He was starting to realize that Elena might be becoming more important to him than just a housekeeper. But that was a dangerous thought. For a man who'd convinced himself that being alone was easier than risking the kind of loss he'd felt when his mother died. For now, it was enough that Elena felt safe. Everything else could wait. By December, the first real snow had started falling across the ranch. Jake watched from his bedroom window as fat flakes drifted down, covering the pastures in a blanket of white. Winter had always been his least favorite season. The days were shorter, the work was harder, and the isolation felt heavier when you were stuck inside for days at a time. But this year felt different. This year, there were warm lights glowing in the kitchen windows when he came in from feeding the cattle. This year, there was someone waiting with hot coffee and a smile that had become less shy and more genuine as the weeks passed. Elena had been with him for almost 2 months now, and the change in her was remarkable. She'd gained weight, and her face had lost that hollow, desperate look. Her hair was shiny and healthy again, usually pulled back in a neat braid while she worked. She moved through the house with confidence now, humming old songs in Spanish while she cooked or cleaned. More importantly, she laughed. Real laughter that started in her eyes and spread across her whole face. Jake had discovered that Elena had a sense of humor that had been buried under all that fear and exhaustion. She would tease him gently about his habit of leaving coffee cups all over the house, or the way he talked to his cattle like they were old friends. "You know, they can't understand you, right?" she'd said one morning, watching him through the kitchen window as he explained to a particularly stubborn cow why she needed to move to the other pasture. "Bessie understands every word I say," Jake had replied with mock seriousness. "She just chooses to ignore me." "Like most females I know?" Elena had thrown a dish towel at him for that comment, and they'd both dissolved into laughter. The house had been transformed too. Elena had found his mother's old sewing basket and had spent her evenings mending curtains and making new cushions for the kitchen chairs. She'd arranged his mother's books on the living room shelves and had even convinced Jake to let her hang some of his mother's paintings that had been stored in the attic. She was talented, Elena had said, studying a watercolor landscape of the ranch in springtime. "This should be where people can see it." Jake had avoided looking at his mother's artwork for 3 years because it hurt too much. But seeing it, through Elena's eyes, he could appreciate the beauty instead of just feeling the loss. They'd settled into comfortable routines. Mornings started with coffee and breakfast where they'd plan their respective days. Elena would tackle household projects while Jake worked with the cattle or repaired equipment. Evenings were for simple dinners and quiet conversation, often with Buster sprawled across both their feet under the kitchen table. The turning point came during a fierce winter storm that hit just before Christmas. Jake had been listening to the weather reports all day, watching the sky grow darker and feeling the wind pick up. By evening, snow was falling so hard he could barely see the barn from the house. "This is going to be a bad one," he told Elena as they ate dinner by candlelight. The power had gone out an hour earlier. "Could last for days?" Elena nodded, but she didn't look worried. A few months ago, she would have been terrified by the idea of being trapped anywhere. Now, she seemed almost content with the idea of being snowed in. The power stayed out for 3 days. They moved their sleeping arrangements to the living room, where Jake kept the fireplace burning around the clock. Elena would curl up in his mother's old rocking chair with a book while Jake sat on the couch, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the flames dance in the fireplace. On the second night, with the wind howling outside and snow piling up against the windows, they found themselves talking in a way they never had before. Maybe it was the intimacy of sharing the warm circle of firelight in the otherwise dark house. Maybe it was the way the storm made the outside world seem very far away. "I never thought I'd feel safe anywhere again," Elena said quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "After I left home, I spent 2 months looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. I couldn't sleep more than a few hours at a time." Jake poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks up the chimney. "What changed?" "You," she said simply. "This place. The way you've never made me feel like I owe you anything more than honest work. The way you've never asked questions I wasn't ready to answer." Jake felt something tighten in his chest. He'd been trying not to think too hard about how much Elena had come to mean to him. She was supposed to be his housekeeper, nothing more. But somewhere along the way, she'd become the person he looked forward to seeing every morning. The person who made even the most ordinary day feel warmer. "I was pretty lonely before you showed up," he admitted. "I told myself I was fine living alone, but I wasn't. This house felt like a tomb." Elena left her chair and came to sit beside him on the couch. It was the first time she'd ever chosen to be that close to him. Jake could smell the faint scent of the lavender soap she used, could see the way the firelight brought out gold highlights in her dark hair. "I was so angry for so long," Elena continued. "Angry at my father for trying to control my life. Angry at myself for being too scared to fight back sooner. Angry at the world for being so hard. And now?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Now, I think maybe everything had to happen exactly the way it did so I'd end up here, with you." Something shifted in the air between them. Jake turned to look at Elena, really look at her, and saw that she was already watching him. Her dark eyes reflected the firelight, and there was something in her expression that made his heart start beating faster. "Elena," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." When Jake kissed her, it was gentle and careful, like he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly, but Elena didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the warmth of the firelight while the storm raged outside. For Jake, it felt like coming home in a way he'd never experienced before. For Elena, it was the first time in her life that being close to a man felt like a choice rather than an obligation. "We don't have to rush anything," Jake murmured against her hair. "We have time." Elena pulled back to look at him. "I've never with anyone I actually cared about," she said, her cheeks flushing pink. "I don't know how to do this." Jake touched her face gently. "Neither do I. We'll figure it out together." When the storm finally passed and the power came back on, something fundamental had changed between them. They didn't talk about it directly, but it was there in the way Elena would brush her hand against Jake's arm when she passed him his coffee. It was there in the way Jake would find excuses to work closer to the house so he could catch glimpses of her through the windows. Elena still slept in her own room upstairs, and Jake still maintained respectful boundaries. But there was an understanding between them now, an acknowledgement that they'd become more than employer and employee, more than friends sharing a house. They began making plans for spring improvements to the ranch. Elena wanted to expand the garden and maybe try raising some chickens. Jake talked about adding a new room to the house, maybe a proper office where he could keep his ranch records organized. They spoke in terms of we and us and next year, and neither of them questioned the assumption that they'd still be together when spring came. It felt natural, like they'd been building toward this all along. One evening in late December, as they sat at the kitchen table after dinner, Elena reached across and took Jake's hand. "I want you to know," she said, "that for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of tomorrow. I'm actually looking forward to it." Jake squeezed her hand gently. "So am I." Outside, snow continued to fall softly, covering the ranch in peaceful silence. Inside, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances sat planning a future together, their hands intertwined on the worn kitchen table that had become the center of their small, perfect world. February brought an early thaw to the ranch, and with it came changes that Elena couldn't ignore. At first she blamed her queasy stomach on something she'd eaten. The nausea hit her every morning like clockwork, usually right after the smell of coffee brewing reached her upstairs bedroom. For 3 days, she forced herself to get up and cook breakfast for Jake, fighting waves of sickness while trying to act normal. But on the 4th morning, she barely made it to the bathroom before losing what little she'd managed to eat the night before. Elena sat on the cold bathroom floor, her head spinning and her heart racing. She'd been trying not to think about the obvious explanation, but she couldn't deny it anymore. Her monthly cycle was 2 weeks late, and combined with the morning sickness, there was only one logical conclusion: she was pregnant. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Elena wrapped her arms around her knees and tried to breathe through the panic that was rising in her throat. How could she have been so careless? How could she have let this happen? But even as fear flooded through her, another part of her mind was quietly calculating. She and Jake had been together for the first time during that winter storm 6 weeks ago. If she was right about the timing, the baby would be due sometime in October, 9 months from when Jake had first found her at the church. Elena spent the rest of that day in a daze, going through the motions of her daily routine while her mind raced. She watched Jake over breakfast, noting the easy smile he gave her when she refilled his coffee cup, the way he talked about his plans for expanding the cattle herd in the spring. He looked happy, content, like a man who'd found his place in the world. What would he think when she told him? Would he see this pregnancy as a trap? A complication he hadn't signed up for when he'd offered her a job and a place to stay. Elena had grown up watching her mother's friends deal with unplanned pregnancies. Some of the men stepped up and did the right thing. Others disappeared in the middle of the night, leaving the women to figure things out alone. She couldn't bear the thought of Jake looking at her with resentment or obligation instead of the warmth she'd grown so used to seeing in his eyes. For a week, Elena kept the news to herself. She found excuses to leave the room when the coffee was brewing, claiming she needed to start the laundry or check on something upstairs. She forced herself to eat crackers before getting out of bed, trying to settle her stomach before facing the day. But Jake wasn't stupid. He'd grown up on a ranch, had been around pregnant cattle and horses his whole life. He knew the signs. "Elena," he said gently one morning when she'd rushed out of the kitchen for the 3rd time in an hour, "we need to talk." Elena was standing at the kitchen sink, gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles were white. She could see Jake's reflection in the window, standing behind her with his hands in his pockets and concern written all over his face. "I know," she whispered. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you." Jake moved closer, but he didn't touch her. Elena could feel the warmth of his presence behind her, solid and reassuring. "Tell me what?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Elena turned around slowly, finally meeting his eyes. "I'm pregnant, Jake, about 6 weeks along, I think." She watched his face carefully, looking for any sign of anger or regret. Instead, Jake's expression went through a series of changes: surprise, then something that looked almost like wonder, and finally a smile that was bigger than any she'd ever seen from him. "Really?" he asked, and his voice was filled with such joy that Elena felt her eyes start to tear up. "You're not angry?" Jake stepped forward and gently took her hands in his. "Angry? Elena, this is ... double quotes." He shook his head, still smiling. "This is the best news I've had in years." Elena stared at him in amazement. "But we weren't planning this. It's going to change everything." "I know," Jake said, "and I can't wait." Over the next few days, as Elena's morning sickness continued and the reality of the pregnancy settled in, they talked about their future in ways they never had before. Jake admitted that he'd been hoping for children someday, but had given up on the idea when his mother got sick, and he'd focused all his energy on taking care of her and the ranch. "I always figured I'd missed my chance," he told Elena one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset. "Thought maybe I was meant to be alone." Elena rested her hand on her still flat stomach. "And now?" "Now I think maybe everything happens for a reason. You showing up at the church, us finding each other, this baby. Maybe it was all supposed to happen exactly this way." But even as they talked about the future, Elena couldn't shake her fears about the past. She'd been looking over her shoulder for months, always worried that someone from her old life would track her down. A baby would make running impossible. A baby would make her vulnerable in ways she'd never been before. "What if they find me?" she asked Jake one night, voicing the fear that had been keeping her awake. "What if Roberto or my father figure out where I am?" Jake's jaw tightened at the mention of the man Elena's father had tried to force her to marry. "Then they'll have to go through me first." "Jake, you don't understand. Roberto has money, connections. He's not the kind of man who gives up easily." "Neither am I," Jake said firmly. "And this is my land, Elena, my home. Nobody's going to take you away from here unless you want to go." The conversation about marriage came up naturally, not as a grand romantic gesture, but as a practical discussion between two people who'd already committed their lives to each other in all the ways that mattered. "We should make it official," Jake said one morning over breakfast. "Before the baby comes. I want everyone to know that you're my wife, that this child is mine." Elena looked down at her hands, still struggling with old fears and insecurities. "You don't have to marry me just because I'm pregnant. I don't want you to feel trapped." Jake reached across the table and tilted her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "Elena, I'm not asking you to marry me because you're pregnant. I'm asking because I can't imagine my life without you in it. The baby just makes it more important to me that we do this right." Elena searched his face and saw only honesty there. No obligation, no resentment, just a quiet certainty that made her heart skip a beat. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Really sure? Because once we do this, there's no going back." Jake smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made her feel like the most important person in the world. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." They were married on a warm Saturday morning in late March at St. Mary's Chapel, the same church where they'd first met. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony with tears in his eyes, clearly delighted to see the happy ending to a story that had started with such uncertainty. Elena wore a simple blue dress that she'd sewn herself, with room for her growing belly. Jake had bought his first new suit in over a decade and looked so handsome it took Elena's breath away. There were only a handful of witnesses, a few neighbors who'd become friends, the church secretary and old Mrs. Patterson who ran the general store and had insisted on bringing flowers from her garden. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. When Jake slipped the plain gold band onto Elena's finger, she felt something settle in her chest that she'd never experienced before: safety, security, the knowledge that she belonged somewhere, to someone, and that no one could take that away from her. "I promise to protect you and this baby with everything I have," Jake said as part of his vows. "I promise to be the husband you deserve and the father our child needs." Elena's vows were simpler but no less heartfelt. "I promise to build a life with you that's worth all the pain it took to get here. I promise to love you not just for saving me, but for seeing who I could become. After the ceremony, they had a small reception in the church hall with cake that Mrs. Patterson had baked and coffee that was probably too strong but perfectly suited to the occasion. Elena found herself laughing more than she had in months, surrounded by people who had accepted her as one of their own without question. As they drove home to the ranch as husband and wife, Elena rested her hand on her growing belly and felt the future stretching out ahead of them like an open road. There would be challenges, she knew. Pregnancy and childbirth, learning to be parents, building a marriage that would last through good times and bad. But for the first time in her life, Elena wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. She had Jake beside her, a baby growing inside her, in a home where she could finally stop running and start living. The scared, desperate woman who had been sleeping outside the church just 6 months ago felt like someone from another lifetime. In her place sat a wife, soon-to-be mother, and partner in building something beautiful and lasting. As they pulled into their driveway, Jake reached over and squeezed her hand. "Ready to start our new life, Mrs. Morrison?" Elena smiled, testing out the sound of her new name in her mind. More than ready. Spring came early to the Morrison ranch that year, bringing with it a sense of new beginnings that seemed to touch everything around them. Elena's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the warmer months, and watching her body change to accommodate their growing child filled Jake with a wonder he'd never experienced before. By May, Elena's belly had rounded out enough that she had to start wearing the loose dresses she'd sewn for herself. Jake found himself constantly amazed by the changes in his wife. She seemed to glow with an inner light that made her more beautiful every day. Her hair grew thicker and shinier, and there was a contentment in her eyes that had replaced the haunted look she'd carried when he first found her. Jake became fiercely protective of Elena as her pregnancy advanced. He hired Tommy Wilson, a young man from town, to help with the heavier ranch work so Elena wouldn't feel pressured to do anything too strenuous around the house. He made sure she got plenty of rest and ate regular meals, even though Elena protested that she felt perfectly fine. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass." She would tease him when he insisted on carrying heavy laundry baskets or reaching for things on high shelves. "Humor me," Jake would reply. Taking the basket from her hands anyway, Elena used the extra time to focus on preparing for the baby. She converted his mother's old sewing room into a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow since they didn't know if they were having a boy or a girl. She sewed tiny clothes and blankets using fabric she found in his mother's collection, her hands working with the same patient care she brought to everything else. Jake found himself drawn to the nursery. In the evenings, standing in the doorway and trying to imagine what it would be like to hold his own child. He'd grown up around babies in their small community, but the idea of being responsible for a tiny person who would depend on him for everything felt both thrilling and terrifying. "What if I'm not good at it?" he asked Elena one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her belly. "Good at what?" "Being a father. What if I don't know what to do?" Elena covered his hand with hers. "Then we'll figure it out together." Nobody knows how to be a parent until they become one. As summer progressed, their neighbors began treating them like the established married couple they'd become. Mrs. Patterson would stop by with extra vegetables from her garden and advice about pregnancy that Elena accepted graciously, even when it contradicted what the doctor in town had told her. The church ladies organized a small baby shower, presenting Elena with hand-knitted blankets and baby clothes that brought tears to her eyes. Jake watched Elena navigate these social situations with growing confidence and realized that she'd found her place in their small community. She was no longer the frightened stranger who'd been sleeping outside the church. She was Mrs. Morrison, Jake's wife, a respected member of the community who contributed homemade pies to church socials and helped organize the annual harvest festival. By July, Elena's belly had grown large enough that she had to sleep propped up on pillows to be comfortable. Jake would sometimes wake in the middle of the night to find her sitting by the window, one hand on her stomach and a peaceful expression on her face. "Can't sleep?" he'd ask, coming to sit beside her. The baby's active tonight," Elena would reply, guiding Jake's hand to where she could feel movement. I think he's going to be a night owl like his father. Or she's going to be stubborn like her mother, Jake would counter, marveling at the sensation of life moving beneath his palm. They decided not to find out the baby's gender ahead of time, preferring to be surprised. But they'd chosen names for both possibilities. Samuel for a boy, after Jake's grandfather who'd built the ranch. Isabella for a girl, after Elena's grandmother who taught her to sew and cook and had been the one bright spot in her difficult childhood. As Elena's due date approached in late August, Jake found himself checking on her constantly. He'd installed a bell in the kitchen that Elena could ring if she needed him while he was working outside. He kept the truck gassed up and ready at all times, with a bag packed for the hospital in the county seat 30 miles away, but the baby had other plans. Elena's labor started on a sweltering Thursday evening in mid-August, nearly 2 weeks before her due date. Jake had been in the barn checking on a cow that seemed ready to calve when he heard the bell ringing frantically from the house. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, bursting through the kitchen door to find Elena gripping the back of a chair, her face flushed and her breathing rapid. "It's time," she said between breaths. The contractions started about an hour ago, but they're getting closer together. Jake's mind went blank for a moment. All his careful planning, all his preparations. And suddenly he couldn't remember where he'd put the hospital bag or whether he had enough gas in the truck. "Hospital," he said, his voice coming out higher than usual. "We need to get to the hospital." But as Jake helped Elena toward the door, she suddenly stopped and gripped his arm tightly. "Jake," she said, her voice tight with pain and something that might have been panic. "I don't think we're going to make it to the hospital." Dr. Mitchell, the town's only doctor, arrived 20 minutes later to find Jake pacing the living room like a caged animal while Elena labored in their bedroom with Mrs. Patterson acting as an impromptu midwife. "First babies usually take their time," Dr. Mitchell said calmly, washing his hands in the kitchen sink. "But this little one seems to be in a hurry." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Jake found himself relegated to boiling water and fetching clean towels, feeling utterly useless while Elena did the hardest work of her life just down the hall. He could hear her breathing through contractions, occasionally calling his name. When the pain got particularly intense, Mrs. Patterson emerged from the bedroom several times to give him updates. "She's doing beautifully," the older woman assured him. "Strong as an ox, that wife of yours." Finally, just as the sun was beginning to set, Jake heard a sound that stopped his heart. A thin, angry cry that could only be coming from one source. "Jake!" Elena called, her voice tired but triumphant. "Come meet your son?" Jake's legs felt unsteady as he walked into the bedroom. Elena was propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat but her face radiant with joy. In her arms was a tiny, red-faced baby who was making his displeasure, with the world known through lusty cries. "Samuel," Elena said softly, looking down at the baby with an expression of pure love. "Just like we planned." Dr. Mitchell handed Jake a pair of scissors. "Would you like to cut the cord, Dad?" Dad, Jake had never heard a word that sounded so important. With shaking hands, he did as the doctor instructed, officially separating his son from the woman who'd carried him into the world. When Elena placed Samuel in Jake's arms for the first time, everything else in the world seemed to fade away. The baby was so small, so perfect, with tiny fingers that gripped Jake's thumb with surprising strength. Samuel had Elena's dark hair and what looked like it would be Jake's nose, but his eyes were still the unfocused blue of all newborns. "Hello, little man," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your dad." As if responding to his voice, Samuel stopped crying and seemed to focus on Jake's face. In that moment, Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a love so fierce and protective that it took his breath away. "He looks just like you," Elena said, watching father and son with tears in her eyes. "He's got your stubborn streak already," Jake replied, noting how the baby seemed determined to stay awake despite clearly being exhausted from his journey into the world. Over the next few days, Jake discovered that becoming a father was everything he'd hoped for and nothing like he'd expected. Samuel was a good baby, sleeping and eating on a fairly predictable schedule, but Jake found himself checking on him constantly, marveling at how someone so small could completely reshape his understanding of what mattered in life. Elena proved to be a natural mother, patient and intuitive in ways that amazed Jake. She seemed to know instinctively what Samuel needed, whether it was food or comfort or just someone to talk to him in the soft, musical voice she used when they were alone. The whole community embraced the newest Morrison. Pastor Williams came by to offer prayers for the family's health and happiness. Mrs. Patterson appeared with enough casseroles to feed them for a week. Even gruff old Mr. Henderson from the neighboring ranch stopped by with a hand-carved wooden horse he'd made for the baby 3 weeks after Samuel's birth. Jake found himself sitting on the front porch with his son sleeping in his arms while Elena dozed in the rocking chair beside him. The evening was peaceful, with cattle lowing softly in the distance and the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Jake thought back to that October morning when he'd found Elena sleeping outside St. Mary's Chapel. If someone had told him then that 9 months later he'd be a husband and father, he would have laughed. But here he was, holding his son and watching his wife sleep in the gentle evening light. Feeling more complete than he'd ever imagined possible, Samuel stirred in his arms. Making the soft sounds that babies make when they're dreaming, Jake adjusted his hold, marveling again at how natural it felt to care for this tiny person who turned his organized, predictable life upside down in the best possible way.